Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to I Hate Rock Music. And today I'm going to do a video on a progressive band. And I haven't really covered progressive bands as much. And I'm going to start trying to cover some more. I'm going to do a video on Indian Summer pretty soon. But of course, a lot of people know about Genesis and Yes and King Crimson and ELP and all that stuff. But there's a whole barrage of prog bands, as most collectors know, and you don't even need to be a collector to know that there's a ton of progressive bands out there, and of course, a lot of them didn't make it, and some of them are really rare, like this band Spring. And the band was around from 1970 to 1972. Pat Moran on vocals and mellotron, and he ended up being a engineer at Rockfield. So this album was recorded at Rockfield, the world famous studio in Wales. And so Pat Moran went from this band to being an engineer there. But Pat Moran on vocals and mellotron, Ray Martinez on guitar and mellotron. He had a nice history after this band as well, Alcatraz, Gypsy, and played in Robert Plant's band. Then we have Kips Brown on piano, organ, and mellotron. He ended up playing with Andy Fairweather Lowe, Adrian Maloney on bass, and Pick Withers on drums and glockenspiel. And he ended up being the drummer in Dire Straits of all things. So a lot of these guys ended up doing pretty well, and you probably noticed that uh, three of the members of the band play mellotron, and so mellotron figures a lot on this record. And one of the things that gives it that progressive sound. And Gus Dudgeon, he's popped up in a lot of my videos. Definitely a famous producer in the UK and did a lot of both well-known and lesser-known bands, and including Audience. Probably end up doing a video on Audience at some point. But the Spring album came out with a really elaborate cover on Neon Records, which is a subsidiary of RCA. And so there's a couple of great albums on Neon. I think Indian Summer might have been on Neon. I might be mistaken. So the Spring album came out in 1971, and one of the things that's cool about it as a progressive album is there's no grandstanding. There's not a lot of epic solos and drum solos and things like that. And there's also no pseudo classical stuff. Bands like Yes had a lot of classical influences and whatnot. And this is pretty much a straight progressive record. There's no classical elements to it per se. And there's lots of layers, and that's another thing that's really impressive about this record. There's a lot of keyboards and then mellotron as well, and then really interesting layering of all the other instruments in the band, and um, and also it's a ensemble work. So once again, unlike some of these bands that have a lot of grandstanding, this band is a combination of elements to create the whole, and just really great ensemble work. And they sound like they were pretty tuned into each other. And then there's some really thoughtful arrangements, and that's really important in progressive rock, of course. And they really do a good job, because as a progressive band, in a lot of ways, they're not as dramatic as some of the other progressive bands. And as I mentioned, they don't do a lot of grandstanding and jamming, and there's no classical elements. So they really depend on having the material be really good, and the material is subtle, but and nuanced in a lot of cases, but great compositions and great arrangements, and it really makes this record work. So it starts out with a song called "The Prisoner," which right off the bat comes in with some mellotron. The rhythm section's pretty subtle, but a really nice melody and great keyboard work. And as I mentioned, right off the bat, you get these layers. They really layer everything nicely. Very, very rich tapestry they put together. And then you get the second tune, Grail. Got some really tasty guitar, so you find out that Ray Martinez is a pretty decent guitar player. And then again, the arrangement's really great. The second half makes a transition to some mellotron guitar and keyboard tapestries and extrapolations of the beginning of Grail. And then has some nice keyboards and acoustic guitar, and a lot of it's instrumental. So a beautiful intro too, as I mentioned before. So really great introduction to the band right off the bat. Those two songs, you get these heady arrangements, a lot of nuance playing, great uh, um, great compositions with really nice melodies as well. Then you get to Boats, which is acoustic, mostly acoustic, somewhat of a ballad per se, with some electric guitar in there to give it more of a balance in the middle of a progressive record. And then you get into a couple of stunners. Shipwrecked Soldier has doubled vocals, has a really cool military drum part. Uh, in the context of this record, it's probably one of the ones that I would qualify as a rocker. Really nice guitar lines. The mellotron is really nice. Killer arrangement, and then the ending is spectacular. So there's a couple real stunners on here. The other real stunner for me is Inside Out. Great guitar work. We finally get to hear the glockenspiel. The guitar work is some of the most striking on the record, including some great guitar picking. And then it has a really great arrangement. Starts off a little more, a little slower, and then picks up speed. And all these songs on here are a little longer, so they get a chance to develop. And then there's a song on here between those two called Golden Fleece, once again with the mellotron, nice guitar work, great interplay, nice developments, really solid British rock. And that's one of the things that strikes me about this record. It's really nice balance between progressive rock and then just your classic British rock. And I've noticed there's a few records like this one around, but it's a really nice mix because a lot of these progressive bands are really everything you imagine a progressive rock band being with all those elements. And then, of course, there's these classic British rock bands that sometimes you can't really pigeonhole so easily because they got country and folk and blues influences. But this mix that Spring has between classic British rock and then these progressive elements really makes the record special for me. And then it finishes up with Song to Absent Friends, which is definitely a ballad with mostly just piano and vocals. So a nice wind down towards the end of the record, and then it finishes up with Gazing, which just has a great arrangement, great dynamics, and all the elements I talked about earlier in the record. So we just have this one record. Of course, it's insanely rare, very expensive right now. Has this really great elaborate color cover. That is a trifold cover. They did sessions for a second LP, but it just never really happened. I don't know if there's stuff in the vault that could be released later or added as bonus tracks. I'll have to snoop around and see if there's been reissues of the Spring that have bonus tracks. But they were around from 70, 72, so 2 years, and we managed to get this one album out of them. But it's a real gem and a little understated. So, as usual, I'll put the link below. Check it out, and I'll try to do more progressive bands. I'm trying to do mostly obscure bands because everybody knows about all the big bands. So I'm sticking to a lot of more obscure stuff. And Spring is definitely pretty obscure, but very satisfying listen. I've grown to love this record over the years, and its charms have revealed themselves, and all the special qualities that they have revealed themselves. And it's a great record. It went for me. Went from being a good record to a great record, and I bought it in about 75 in the used racks, 1975, and um, didn't quite get it as much as I do now. And after having all these years to listen to it, it's a great one. So it deserves its legendary status. All right, thanks for watching. Appreciate it. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.